Blood dripped down her hand as Friday gazed at the small baby cradled in her arms, the Jarl's son, with eyes as blue as the ocean but the same aquiline nose as that stranger. She trembled. The truth could never be revealed, or they would all die. Thank you for joining this story. This channel is just beginning its journey, and every subscription means the world, helping us reach our first 1,000 followers and keep these tales alive. If you enjoy what you hear, please consider subscribing and sharing where you're watching from. Your support truly fuels this project, and we're honored to have you here. The cold grip of winter had tightened its hold on the village of Ravnholm. Snow lay thick on the ground, muffling footsteps and softening the sharp edges of the humble wooden homes. The sky was a bleak slate. Ashen clouds pressed low over the jagged peaks that guarded the fjord. The wind carried a biting chill, slicing through even the thickest wool and furs. Ice glazed the frozen river, its surface cracked and glimmering faintly under the weak light of the short day. In this harsh, unforgiving landscape moved Friday's daughter, the Priestess of Freya. She was a woman of 32 winters, though the years etched into her face told a story far beyond mere age. Her skin was pale as fresh milk, marked by faint freckles that dusted her shoulders like scattered ash. Her long, black hair, once flowing freely, was now cut short and dyed a deep red with herbs she had brewed herself, an attempt to cloak her identity from the past that haunted her. The icy wind tugged at the edges of her dark blue linen tunic, embroidered with delicate runes of fertility and protection, each stitch a prayer sewn into the fabric. Friday's boots crunched through the snow as she moved with a purposeful grace, her breath a cloud of mist that vanished quickly in the cold air. Her gray-green eyes scanned the village, watching the smoke curl from chimneys, the faint glow of hearth fires flickering through shuttered windows. Despite the warmth within, the cold of the world outside seeped into every corner, a constant reminder of the fragility of life here. She carried with her a small satchel of herbs and roots, the familiar scents of sweet fern, juniper, and mugwort mingling beneath the wolf fur draped over her shoulders. The scent was comforting, a tether to her role as healer and keeper of sacred rites. Yet, beneath that surface, a storm of unease churned in her chest. For 3 years, this village had been gripped by a shadow darker than the winter night. The Jarl Ragnar Thorson and his wife, Sigrid Harald's daughter, had long struggled with the cruel fate of barrenness. The Jarl, a man both feared and respected, was slowly losing his patience. Without an heir, his power was as fragile as the ice on the river, threatening to shatter with the slightest pressure. Whispers of doubt grew louder among the clans, their eyes turning toward other leaders with secure bloodlines. Friday had been a pillar for the village, a beacon calling on Freya's blessings to bring fertility to the land and its people. Each dawn she had performed her morning rites by the sacred stone, her voice rising in ancient chants to the morning star that pierced the twilight. She had tended to the sick, offered counsel to the desperate, and sought guidance in the runes that were her constant companions. Yet, despite her prayers and offerings, the Jarl's household remained barren. Inside her modest dwelling at the edge of the village, Friday prepared her tools with ritual precision. The small cabin was worn but sturdy, its thick wooden walls lined with shelves cluttered with bones, feathers, and earthenware jars filled with dried herbs and powders. The scent of burning juniper mingled with the earthy aroma of fresh moss and crushed bark. A small fire crackled low in the hearth, casting dancing shadows that flickered against the walls. She reached into a carved oak chest and carefully removed a silver chalice, its surface engraved with the intertwined symbols of Freya, cats and falcons soaring in eternal flight. She traced the designs with a finger, feeling the cool metal beneath her touch. Beside it lay a slender bone-handled dagger, its blade sharpened to a fine edge, glinting faintly in the firelight. Small glass vials containing tinctures and powders rested nearby, their corks sealed tight. Her thoughts were heavy, weighed down by the knowledge that the solution she sought was perilous. The runes she read under the light of the full moon had spoken clearly. A forbidden ritual had to be performed. This ritual demanded a sacrifice of blood, a weaving of foreign seed, a crossing of boundaries that could summon the wrath of gods and men alike. The door creaked softly, and Friday turned to see Sigrid step inside, wrapped in a thick cloak of fox fur, her blonde hair braided and adorned with amber beads that caught the weak firelight. The noblewoman's face was etched with lines of hope and despair intertwined. Her blue eyes met Friday's with a silent plea. "The dreams do not cease," Sigrid said, settling by the hearth, hands trembling as she clasped a cup of warm mead. "I see a child, a son, but he slips through my fingers like the morning mist." Friday moved closer, her voice dropping to a solemn whisper. "The gods test us with shadows before dawn. But I have seen a path, a way to break the curse that haunts your womb." Sigrid's grip tightened on the cup, her knuckles white. "Anything. I would do anything." The Jarl's patience wears thin. "Last night, I overheard him speak of taking another wife. Another bloodline to secure his throne. I cannot bear it." The priestess's heart constricted. She had seen that same desperation mirrored in the faces of countless women before, yet what she was about to propose went beyond simple remedies or blessings. It was a breach of sacred law and trust. "The ritual I speak of is called Fertility," Friday said carefully, the word tasting like ash on her tongue. "The blood's liberation. It is ancient and forbidden. It demands the seed of a stranger, one whose blood does not mingle with ours. Only then can the curse be lifted." Sigrid's breath caught, disbelief and fear flooding her gaze. A stranger? But how? And what of the Jarl? If he knew. "Ragnar must never know," Friday said, her voice steady despite the storm raging inside her. "I will guide the ritual in secret. You will drink a potion to open your body to the blessing of Freya. The man, unaware of his role, will be part of the ceremony. When the child is born, the Jarl will believe it his own." The weight of the secret settled between them like a shroud. The sacrifice, the deception, it could unravel everything. Yet, in that bleak hour, hope flickered fragile and bright. The days that followed were a blur of preparation and whispered plans. Friday watched the village with cautious eyes, noting the arrival of a trading ship at the frozen fjord. From its decks disembarked Ethelstan, a Saxon merchant whose broad shoulders and steadfast green eyes marked him as a man untouched by the coldness of this land, yet hardened by the trials of his own. He was a stranger woven into their fate, a man who carried the sun in his gaze and a past marked by scars. His tongue stumbled over the Norse words, his manners foreign yet respectful. Friday observed him closely, weighing his strength, his health, and his ignorance of the deeper currents swirling beneath the surface. On the eve of the winter solstice, when the moon hung full and heavy in the sky, Friday led Sigrid away from the village under a cloak of darkness. The biting wind bit into their faces, biting through layers of fur and cloth as they made their way to a secluded cave high in the mountains. The air was thick with the scent of pine and smoke, the earth beneath their boots uneven and treacherous. Inside the cave, the flicker of torchlight revealed ancient carvings etched into stone, symbols of gods and beasts intertwined in eternal dance. The floor was layered with soft hides, and a small altar bore fresh offerings, fragrant herbs, red berries, and a bowl stained with the blood of a sacrificial goat. The air was heavy and sacred. Friday handed Sigrid a chalice filled with a dark red liquid, thick as blood and bitter with the sharp tang of crushed herbs. "Drink this," she urged softly. "It will open your womb, making it fertile ground for the blessing of Freya." As Sigrid swallowed, her eyes fluttered and her body trembled as the potion took hold. Friday stepped into the cold night to summon Ethelstan, leading him into the cave under the pretense of a welcoming ritual. The merchant's brow furrowed with confusion and curiosity as she explained in broken Saxon that this was a sacred ceremony honoring the gods of the north. Friday began chanting in the ancient tongue, her voice rising and falling like the wind, weaving a tapestry of words that carried the power of the old gods. Circling the fire, she moved with deliberate grace, her hands tracing runes in the air, shadows flickering across her determined face. The ritual unfolded in silence save for the shadow of the past crept closer still. Gaida, the old priestess displaced by Fertility rise, watched from the shadows with eyes like black crows. Her bitterness was a poison, her suspicions sharp as the winter wind. Whispers followed Fertility like a dark cloud, threatening to unravel the fragile peace. When Gaida confronted her in the forest, the cold air was thick with accusation and dread. The ancient woman spoke of betrayal, of forbidden rites, of blood spilt beyond the bounds of law. Threats hung heavy between them, the promise of destruction if the truth were laid bare. Fertility had no choice but to flee, abandoning the village she had served and the woman she had sought to save. The bitter taste of exile was sharp on her tongue as she sailed away under a sky the color of ashes, the weight of loss pressing upon her like a stone. Now, years later, in a distant village where her past was a ghost whispered only in the wind, Fertility tended to the sick and wounded with quiet hands. The sight of a boy with eyes as blue as the sea and a nose so like the stranger's stirred something deep within her, a flicker of hope, of redemption, and a secret she dared not yet speak aloud. The forest lay heavy with the scent of damp earth and fading leaves, the low hum of late autumn pressing against the fragile silence. Fertility moved slowly beneath the skeletal branches, her fingers brushing against the moss-covered trunks, feeling the rough bark beneath her calloused skin. The cool air bit at her cheeks, and a distant caw of a raven echoed, carrying with it a chill that settled deep in her bones. The world around her was muted, the vibrant life of summer surrendered now to the slow decay of the cold season, and yet beneath the stillness, there was unrest, an echo of the turmoil that had followed her for years. She had come here to gather herbs, those precious gifts of the earth that would ease the fever burning in the boy's chest. Halfdan's name lingered on her lips like a whispered prayer, the child who was more than just a boy. He was a living testament to a past she had fled but could never truly escape. The mark of the crescent moon on his wrist was a subtle reminder of a secret buried beneath layers of fear, shame, and hope. Every time she looked at him, she saw the fragile thread between salvation and destruction. Fertility's hands trembled slightly as she knelt beside a patch of mugwort, its silvery leaves soft to the touch. She plucked the herbs with careful precision, mindful of their sacred purpose. The moment was fragile, suspended between the simplicity of the task and the complexity of the life she now led. The weight of her past pressed down like a shadow, yet the need before her was immediate. A child's life hanging precariously between health and death. The footsteps that broke the silence startled her, sudden and uneven on the leaf-strewn path. Fertility rose swiftly, hand instinctively reaching for the small knife at her belt, though she had no intent to use it if she could avoid it. The figure that emerged from the trees was slight and trembling, a young woman draped in threadbare cloth, her face pale and haunted. Her eyes, wide with desperation, locked onto Fertility's with a raw, pleading intensity. "Please," the woman gasped, voice cracking like dry branches. "My son, he is sick, and the healer is gone. They say you know herbs. Will you help us?" Fertility's heart clenched painfully. She could see the traces of hardship etched deep into the woman's features, dark circles beneath sunken eyes, lips cracked and chapped from cold winds, hands clenched like talons in helplessness. The woman's name was lost to Fertility, but her plea was clear, a mother's desperation echoing the very same fears that haunted her own existence. The weight of choice pressed down hard. To help was to risk exposure, to invite suspicion from neighbors who still whispered of the priestess's exile. To ignore was a betrayal of everything she had sworn to protect, the fragile lives, the sacred bond between healer and those who sought her aid. Fertility took a slow breath, the cold air filling her lungs, steadying her racing heart. She stepped forward, her voice steady but soft. "Bring me to your son." The woman's relief was immediate. tears glimmering in her eyes as she nodded and turned back toward the village concealed just beyond the tree line. Friday followed, the forest seeming to close around her, a cage forged by the past she could not outrun. The small hut was no more than a hovel, its walls sagging and darkened by smoke and neglect. Smoke curled weakly from a cracked clay chimney, the scent of burning peat mingling with the sharp tang of sickness. Inside, the air was heavy and warm, thick with the odor of sweat and fever. A boy lay on a crude pallet of straw, his small chest rising and falling with shallow breaths, skin flushed with heat and pallor. Halfdan. Even in his weakened state, the boy's striking blue eyes held a fierce light, an ember flickering beneath the weight of illness. Friday felt the familiar pang in her chest, a mixture of sorrow, guilt, and fierce protectiveness. This child, born of a secret kept in shadows, was vulnerable in a way she could no longer ignore. She knelt beside him, placing a cool palm against his burning forehead. The heat seared through her gloves, sending a shiver up her arm. Her mind raced through remedies, potions, and prayers, searching for a path to ease the fever that threatened to consume him. Yet beyond the physical ailment, there was the deeper wound, one etched into the fabric of his very existence. The woman watched silently, eyes filled with a mixture of hope and fear. "The others say he should be left to die," she whispered, voice barely audible over the crackling fire. "They believe he is cursed, that he brings dishonor." Freydis's gaze hardened. The superstition and fear that clung to the boy were as dangerous as the illness itself. "No," she said firmly. "He is not cursed. I will do what I can." As she gathered her supplies from her satchel, the flickering torchlight cast long, restless shadows across the cramped walls. The moment was heavy with unspoken truths and the weight of past choices. Freydis's hands moved with practiced grace, crushing herbs, boiling water over a small iron pot, mixing salves and infusions. The ritual of healing was familiar, a thread of order amid chaos. Yet beneath the surface, her thoughts were turbulent. Each heartbeat was a drumbeat of warning. Danger lurked not only in the boy's fever, but in the eyes and ears of those who might discover her presence. Her own survival depended on silence and caution, but here, in the flickering firelight, the line between protector and hunted blurred. The night deepened, the cold pressing harder against the thin walls of the hut. Halfdan's breathing steadied under the touch of the herbs, his fever retreating like a tide beaten back by the shore. Friday sat beside him, watching the rise and fall of his chest, the soft sheen of sweat on his pale skin. A fragile peace settled over the room, but the silence was brittle and fleeting. The mother's voice broke the quiet. "Why do you care so much? You could leave, be safe. Why stay?" Freydis's eyes met hers, the weight of years pressing into the gaze. "Because he is not just any child. He belongs to this world, to a future that still holds hope." Her voice was low, heavy with a mixture of pain and resolve. "I have run from my past, but I cannot run from what I must do now." Outside, the wind howled, rattling the thin wooden walls like a restless spirit. The world beyond was harsh and unforgiving, ruled by laws written in blood and honor, but in this small, dim room, a different struggle unfolded, one of mercy, secrecy, and survival. For hours, Friday tended to Halfdan, her hands steady despite the storm inside her soul. She whispered old prayers to Freya, invoking the goddess's strength and grace, hoping that the blessing once sought in secret might now protect this child in the open light of danger. When dawn crept through the cracks in the walls, painting the room with pale gold, Friday allowed herself a moment of quiet. The fever had broken, and the boy's breathing was easier, but the shadows of what lay ahead were long and unyielding. The woman, her expression softened with gratitude and cautious hope, finally spoke the words that had lingered unsaid. "You risk much. If anyone finds you here, they will say you consort with the small hut, nestled at the edge of the forest, seemed barely more than a shadow beneath the towering pines. Its weathered wooden walls sagged under the weight of years, darkened by smoke and the relentless march of time. Friday pushed the creaking door open and stepped inside, the cold air swarming out like a restless spirit. The scent of peat smoke mixed with the stale warmth of fever and sweat. It was a fragile refuge, but for now, it was the safest place she could offer. Halfdan lay curled on a straw-stuffed pallet, wrapped in threadbare blankets that did little to mask the heat radiating from his small body. His breathing was shallow, faltering beneath the weight of the sickness that gripped him. Freydis's gaze softened as she knelt beside him, careful not to disturb the fragile rise and fall of his chest. His face was pale and clammy, flushed in places by fever, yet his intense blue eyes flickered open briefly, capturing her gaze with a curious, almost knowing look. It was a look that unsettled her, not for what it revealed, but for the haunting question it posed. How much did this child understand of the secrets that clung silently around him? She reached out, her hand trembling slightly, and brushed a damp lock of hair from his forehead. The strands, darkened by sweat, clung to his skin, and in that moment, the weight of her guilt pressed down like a storm. This boy was more than just a child in need. He was the living legacy of a night she wished she could forget, a night marked by desperate hope and forbidden rites. Yet here he was, breathing against the odds, a fragile beacon of life amid the cold shadows. Friday pulled a worn woolen cloak from a hook by the wall, wrapping it gently around Halfdan's thin shoulders. The motion was tender, practiced, a mother's care given by hands that had known too much loss. She reached into her satchel, fingers seeking the small pouch of crushed herbs she had prepared. With a small iron pot simmering over a smoldering fire in the corner, she began brewing a tea, an ancient blend meant to ease fever and soothe the spirit. The scent of chamomile and elderflower soon filled the cramped space, mingling with the sharper aroma of juniper berries. Halfdan's eyes fluttered closed again as the warmth seeped slowly into the room. Friday poured the tea into a wooden cup, careful not to spill a single drop. She lifted him into her arms, cradling him as though he were the most precious thing in the world, a dangerous truth that weighed heavily on her heart. The boy's fragile body pressed against her, his fevered breath hot against her cheek. "Drink," she murmured softly, holding the cup to his lips. His small hands, weak but determined, grasped the rim, and with slow effort, he sipped. The warmth spread through him, a small comfort against the relentless chill of sickness. The room fell into a hush, broken only by the crackling fire and Halfdan's uneven breathing. Friday watched him closely, noting the faint crescent-shaped birthmark on his wrist, a subtle but unmistakable sign that set him apart from others in the village. It was a mark she had seen before, long ago, carved into the runes of the ritual she had performed. A sign that whispered secrets she dared not speak aloud. Outside, the wind rattled the shutters, a mournful sound that echoed the turmoil within her soul. This child, half stranger, half her own flesh, was a silent storm she could neither escape nor deny. As the fever slowly receded, a fragile peace settled over the hut, but the weight of secrecy pressed on her like the relentless frost beyond the door. The woman who had brought Halfdan into her care sat quietly in the corner, her face drawn and etched with worry. Her eyes held a mixture of fierce hope and deep fear, the kind born from years of hardship and whispered suspicions. She spoke at last, her voice a fragile thread in the stillness. "Many say he is cursed," she confessed, glancing toward the sleeping boy. "That the sickness is the god's punishment for blood spilled where it should not be." Friday met her gaze steadily, the lines of fatigue and sorrow etched deep into her own face. "No curse rests on this child," she said firmly. "The gods do not turn their backs so easily. He is marked, yes, but not forsaken. His life is a thread woven by fate's own hand." The woman nodded, tears glistening in her eyes. "I feared you would say otherwise. I have heard the whispers, the rumors. They say the healer's shadow follows death. A silence settled between them, heavy and fragile. Friday traced the faded runic tattoos on her own hands, those ancient symbols etched into her skin as a lifelong bond to Freya and her sacred duty. The weight of the past pressed against her now more than ever, the peril of discovery, the threat of Gyda's vengeful eyes, and the haunting knowledge that the Jarl's wrath was a storm still gathering on the horizon. Yet in this small, dim room, the sharp edges of fear softened, replaced by a quiet resolve. Friday reached out, taking the woman's trembling hand in hers, offering a silent promise of protection. The two women shared a glance, a flicker of understanding bridging the gulf between the sacred and the profane, between the desperate and the hopeful. As night deepened outside, Friday tended to Halfdan with gentle hands, cooling his burning skin with cloths soaked in herbal infusions, whispering prayers to Freya to shield him from harm. The child's breath grew steadier, the fever's grip loosening like the first thaw of spring. In the quiet moments between care and watchfulness, Friday felt a fragile bond growing, unspoken but undeniable. This boy, born of shadow and sacrifice, was her charge, her burden, and perhaps her salvation. The low flicker of candlelight cast dancing shadows on the rough wooden walls, painting the room with patterns of light and dark. Halfdan stirred, his small hand reaching weakly toward Freydis's face, fingertips brushing her cheek in a touch so soft it seemed almost a blessing. A shiver ran through her, a mixture of fear and tenderness that twisted deep in her chest. "He knows," she whispered to herself, voice barely audible over the crackling hearth. "He knows more than he should." Yet the boy's gaze, though clouded by illness, held no fear, only a quiet acceptance, a patience beyond his years. Friday wondered if the seed of destiny was already taking root in his soul, if the gods themselves had woven a path she could yet follow. Outside, the forest stood dark and silent, the chill pressing against the fragile walls like a living thing. Inside, a different kind of warmth blossomed, the fragile hope of life fought for in shadow, the delicate trust forged in whispered breaths and gentle hands. Friday settled beside Halfdan, her thoughts heavy but her heart a little lighter. The road ahead was jagged and uncertain, but for now, this moment was enough. As dawn's pale light crept through the cracks, illuminating the worn floorboards, Friday leaned back against the rough wall, closing her eyes briefly. The scent of herbs and smoke lingered in the air, mingling with the soft sounds of a boy's quiet breathing. She allowed herself a fleeting hope that maybe, just maybe, the gods would grant them mercy, that the sacrifice, the secrets, and the pain would not be in vain. There was much she could not say, many truths hidden beneath layers of silence. But in the stillness of that early morning, the fragile thread between past and future shimmered faintly, a promise that life, however uncertain, could still find a way. The news traveled faster than the cold wind that swept across the fjord, cutting through the trees and settling into the bones of every man, woman, and child in the surrounding villages. Whispers, once confined to the shadowed corners of Ravenholm's mead hall, spilled beyond the thick walls of the hall where the Jarl's feast had been held. Tales of betrayal and forbidden rituals seeped into the ears of neighboring clans, carried by traders, hunters, and wandering skalds. The delicate veil of secrecy that had protected Friday and the child was unraveling, thread by fragile thread. Friday felt the weight of that unraveling even before the first messenger arrived. The air around her small coastal village seemed charged with a restless tension. The usual quiet of twilight was pierced by the distant howl of dogs and the murmur of voices growing louder with each passing day. The villagers, though simple and wary, sensed the gathering storm. Eyes darted in suspicion, and the ever-present fear of witchcraft lingered like a poison in the breath of the land. It was mid-morning when the first party arrived. Mounted men from a nearby clan, their banners marked with sharp black ravens, rode up the narrow path leading to Freydis's humble hut. Their faces were hard, weathered by years of cold winds and battle, their eyes sharp with suspicion and purpose. At their head was a tall, broad-shouldered warrior whose scarred jaw, and piercing gaze bore an authority that brooked no argument. Friday was gathering herbs in the clearing when she spotted a heavy knock thundered against the door, jolting her from her prayers. The warrior's voice carried through the wood, rough and commanding. Friday's Gunnardaughter. By the will of Jarl Ragnar Thorson, you are summoned to answer for crimes against the clan. Open this door, or we will break it down. The name hit her like a blow. Ragnar was still alive, still seeking retribution. The threat in the voice was unmistakable, a promise of violence, of judgment, unforgiving as winter ice. Freydis's fingers tightened around the carved amulet of Freya hanging at her neck. She took a steadying breath and stepped to the door, planting her feet firmly. When she opened it, the cold struck her like a whip, and the warriors flooded inside without invitation, their heavy boots crushing the herbs scattered on the floor. The leader stepped forward, his gaze sweeping the dim interior before settling on Halfdan. Is this the child? The one rumored to be born of forbidden blood? Friday rose, her voice calm but resolute. He is a child in need. No curse rests upon him. The warrior's lips twisted in a grim smile. Your words are as fragile as your lies. The clan will decide his fate. From that moment, Friday knew the fragile peace was shattered. The men demanded she come with them to Ravenholm to face the Jarl's judgment. To refuse was to mark herself an enemy, and to comply meant exposing Halfdan to dangers she could barely imagine. Outside, the villagers gathered, their faces etched with fear and curiosity. Some eyes held pity, others suspicion. Whispers turned to murmurs, and murmurs to outright accusations. The delicate balance Friday had maintained was tipping, threatening to collapse into chaos. As they rode through the frost-hardened fields toward Ravenholm, Freydis's mind raced. Memories flooded back, the cold stone altar, the whispered chants beneath the full moon, the weight of Sigurd's desperate plea, and the sharp betrayal of Gyda's warning. Now, all she had fought to protect was at the mercy of a man whose anger was as fierce as the winter storms. At the great hall, the air was thick with tension. The longhouse's timber walls were decorated with banners stained by time and battle, flickering torchlight casting shadows that danced like restless spirits. The Jarl sat upon his carved throne, his blue eyes like frozen steel, cold and unyielding. His beard, woven with silver threads, framed a face marked by years of war and loss. Friday's Gunnardaughter. Ragnar's voice cut through the silence like a sharpened blade. You stand accused of treachery, of dishonoring your sacred office and betraying the clan's trust. Speak, before the gods and these witnesses. Friday stepped forward, her head held high despite the storm raging within. I sought only to save the clan, to give you an heir when none could be born by other means. Ragnar's gaze flickered with something unreadable, anger, pain, perhaps a shadow of regret. You brought a stranger into our bed, a foreigner's seed in our blood. You dared to deceive me. Behind the Jarl, murmurs rippled through the assembled warriors and clansmen. Faces twisted in betrayal and disbelief. Friday felt the weight of their judgment like a physical blow. I did what was necessary, she said, voice steady though her hands trembled, to break the curse that threatened to end your line. Sigurd's womb was barren, but the gods demanded a sacrifice. I honored their will. Ragnar's fist slammed onto the carved wooden armrest, echoing through the hall. The gods? Or your own selfish defiance? You have broken the sacred laws, Friday. For this, there must be punishment. Suddenly, a voice rose from the crowd, a grizzled elder, once loyal to Gyda, now a reluctant witness to the unfolding storm. And what of the child? Does the clan's future burn with this boy's blood? Or will his presence bring ruin? Freydis's gaze fell to Halfdan, standing silently beside her, his blue eyes wide but unwavering. The boy's very existence was a defiance, a fragile spark amid the gathering darkness. The Jarl's anger shifted, wariness flickering beneath the fury. If the child lives, it is by my will. He will be raised as my own, but his bloodline shall never be questioned. A tense silence followed, broken only by the crackling of the fire and the distant howl of wolves beyond the great doors. In the days that followed, The village was a crucible of fear and suspicion. Gyda's shadow loomed large, her accusations seeping into every corner like a poison. Though she did not appear openly, her words stirred unrest, and those who once revered Priestess now whispered of curses and witchcraft. Priestess found herself caught between two worlds, the fierce loyalty she felt toward Halfdan and the relentless pressure from a community gripped by fear. Each step outside her hut was met with wary eyes and hushed conversations. Children stopped their play to stare, elders shook their heads in disapproval, and warriors questioned her presence near the Jarl's hall. One evening, as the northern lights flickered faintly in the frozen sky, a group of young men approached her dwelling. Their faces were hard, their voices low but edged with menace. "You have brought misfortune upon us all," one said, stepping forward. "The gods will not forgive what you have done. We cannot protect you if the Jarl chooses to punish." Priestess met their glare without flinching. "The child is innocent. He bears no curse. Your anger should be with those who would destroy hope with their fear." The men exchanged uneasy glances but said no more, melting back into the shadows like wolves retreating from the scent of fire. Behind the veil of night, Freydis's thoughts turned to Sigrid and the fate she had escaped. The image of the pale woman's face, marked by heartbreak and resolve, haunted her. What had become of her in the cold grip of the Jarl's wrath? Had her sacrifice been in vain? The harsh truth settled cold as the winter's breath. The world beyond this village was not kind to secrets or mercy. Alliances were fragile, and vengeance was a currency as valuable as gold. The child she protected was a beacon of hope wrapped in a shroud of danger. As the days shortened and the cold deepened, Priestess prepared herself for the coming storm. She moved through the village like a shadow, gathering whispers and watching for signs of movement. The line between protector and fugitive blurred. Every glance carried the weight of accusation, every footstep the threat of discovery. Yet, in the quiet moments, when Halfdan's small hand found hers and the boy's eyes shone with trust, she found a flicker of strength. The world may seek to destroy what she held dear, but in the depths of winter's heart, life still fought to endure. And so, beneath the pale moonlight and the watching stars, Priestess steeled herself. The coming days would test the bonds of blood, faith, and loyalty. The truth was a blade that cut both ways. Wounds that could heal only through courage, sacrifice, and the unyielding will to protect what mattered most. In the gathering shadows of Ravnholm, the battle for the future had only just begun. The cold air bit sharply against Freydis's skin as she stood before the great hall of Ravnholm, the heart of the village where the Jarl's word was law and the past could neither be hidden nor undone. The wooden doors, massive and carved with ancient symbols, loomed before her like the gates of judgment itself. Behind them, the flickering glow of firelight and the low murmur of voices spoke of a gathering storm, an assembly summoned not for celebration, but for reckoning. Freydis's breath came in shallow puffs, the chill wrapping around her like a shroud. Her heart hammered fiercely, each beat a thunder warning of what awaited inside. She was no stranger to fear, nor to endurance, but the weight of this moment was unlike any she had borne before. This was not a ritual where she called upon the gods with whispered prayers or sacred chants. This was a trial by human wrath, where bloodlines and honor clashed in the cold light of mortal judgment. At her side stood Halfdan, the boy whose very existence defied the laws set by clan and blood. His small hand clung to hers with surprising strength, his blue eyes steady despite the storm swirling around them. She saw in him not a mere child, but a spark of fragile hope carried through years of exile and shadow. The door groaned open, and a wave of cold wind spilled out, carrying the scent of smoke, sweat, and the heavy weight of expectation. The longhouse was filled with the village's strongest men, their faces carved by years of hardship and suspicion. Women stood at the edges, some with faces pale and tight with fear, others with eyes that flickered like coals, watching, waiting, judging. At the center, seated upon a high throne carved from ancient oak, sat Jarl Ragnar Thorson. The years had deepened the lines on his face, but his gaze was as sharp and unforgiving as ever. His beard, streaked with silver, framed a mouth set in a hard line, his piercing blue eyes scanning the room like a wolf scenting prey. When the room seemed to shrink under the weight of his words, Freydis's hands, steady but cold, tightened around the amulet of Freya that hung at her neck. She lifted her chin, meeting the Jarl's gaze squarely despite the turmoil twisting in her chest. "I sought only to save this clan," she began, her voice clear and resolute. "For many years, your house was barren. The gods had turned their favor away, and with it, the hope of a future. When every prayer failed, I turned to an ancient rite, one forbidden, yes, but necessary. The child you see is the living proof of that sacrifice." A murmur rippled through the gathered crowd. Some faces twisted in disbelief, others in anger. The air thickened with tension, each breath sharp with accusation. Ragnar's eyes narrowed, the flicker of pain behind his stern facade barely visible. "You dared to bring the seed of a Saxon into the bloodline of Ravnholm. You deceived me, and you betrayed the trust given to you as priestess." Freydis did not flinch. The man did not know. The ritual was hidden from all but the gods. "I carried this burden alone, for the sake of the clan's survival. The child is as much yours as any born of our lands. He is not a curse, but a gift." From the crowd, a grizzled elder stepped forward, his voice rough like gravel. "And what of the woman, Sigrid? Does she live or suffer at your hands?" The weight of that question faltered Freydis's resolve for a moment. The memory of Sigrid's pale face, the silent strength in her eyes, filled her with sorrow. But there was no mercy left in this place for the past. She suffered the wrath of the Jarl, Freydis said softly, voice barely above a whisper. "And I fled to protect what remained, the child and the hope he carries." A faint gasp rose, quickly stifled by the heavy silence pressing down again. Halfdan shifted beside her, his small frame rigid, yet his gaze unflinching. It was as if the boy bore the weight of their judgment not as a victim, but as a bearer of truth too fragile for these hardened halls. Ragnar's hand tightened on the armrest, his voice hardening. "The gods demand punishment for betrayal. Your secret risks the clan's honor and invites the scorn of our ancestors. What say you, Freydis? Will you accept the judgment of Ravnholm?" Freydis took a deep breath, the words burning in her throat. She knew what was demanded, the sacrifice of all she had become, the surrender of the child she had sworn to protect. Yet surrender was not in her nature. "Not now. I accept the judgment," she said quietly. "But know this, any harm that comes to the boy will stain the hands of this clan forever. He is the blood of Ravnholm's future, whether you choose to see it or not." The hall erupted in heated debate, voices rising and falling like waves crashing against jagged rocks. Some called for mercy, recalling the years of service and sacrifice Freydis had given. Others demanded punishment, their words sharp with fear and anger. The old wounds of superstition and suspicion tore at the fragile fabric of the community. Amid the turmoil, a figure stepped forward, Gyda, the former priestess, the shadow that had haunted Freydis since exile. Her eyes, dark and piercing, glinted with ruthless triumph. Her twisted frame leaned heavily on a gnarled staff, her voice cold and accusing. "You speak of honor and survival, Freydis," Gyda hissed, "but you have brought a curse upon this clan. A child born not of our bloodline, a betrayal hidden in darkness. The gods will not forgive, and neither will I." The hall fell silent, the weight of Gyda's words sinking into every heart. Freydis met the old woman's gaze, a fierce defiance burning in her own. "The gods are not blind," Freydis said steadily. "They see truth beyond blood and birth. This child is not a curse, but a chance to break the cycle of despair." Ragnar's eyes flickered with conflict, rage warring with doubt. His voice was low, nearly a growl. "Then the gods will decide his fate. But as Jarl, I will protect my people, even from those I once called kin." The judgment was passed swiftly. Friday was condemned to exile, her fate intertwined once again with the cold winds beyond the village's borders. Halfdan would remain under the Jarl's protection, raised as his son, yet forever marked by the secret that could unravel all. As the assembly dispersed, Friday stood at the threshold of the longhouse, the weight of loss and hope mingling in her heart. She looked down at Halfdan's small hand slipping from hers, and though the pang of separation cut deep, a fragile seed of resolve took root. The path ahead was uncertain, shadowed by the past, and threatened by the future. Yet beneath the scars and secrets, a bond stronger than fear and betrayal endured, a bond woven by sacrifice, love, and the unyielding will to protect the fragile flame of life. Outside, the wind howled through the towering pines, carrying with it the scent of snow and distant seas. Friday drew her cloak tighter, her gaze fixed on the horizon where the first light of dawn bled over the jagged peaks. The gods had tested her beyond reckoning, but in the depths of winter's heart, she would find the strength to endure. For Halfdan, for the clan, for the fragile promise of a future yet to be written. The fire crackled softly in the small cottage, its warm glow a fragile shield against the biting autumn cold that pressed in through the thin wooden walls. Friday sat close to the hearth, her hands wrapped around a chipped clay cup filled with bitter herbal tea. Her eyes rested on the sleeping boy curled beneath the threadbare blankets, his chest rising and falling in a steady rhythm that seemed miraculous after days of fever and fear. Halfdan's pale face was touched by the dancing light, his blue eyes closed in peaceful rest, the faint crescent-shaped birthmark on his wrist catching the fire's flicker. To an untrained eye, he was just a sick child recovering from a harsh illness. But to Friday, he carried the weight of secrets and a legacy born of desperation and sacrifice. The blood that ran through his veins was not just a mixture of Saxon and Norse. It was a symbol of fragile hope in a world ruled by harsh laws and harsher judgments. For years, Friday had lived with the burden of choices made beneath the full moon, in a cave far from the eyes of her people. She had carried guilt like a stone chained to her soul, the knowledge that the child she protected was the product of a forbidden ritual, one that had saved a lineage but shattered others. Yet, here in this quiet moment, she allowed herself a breath of relief. Halfdan was alive. He had survived the fever, the exile, and the whispers that sought to shatter him. Her gaze lifted as the door creaked open. Ethelstan stepped inside, his tall form silhouetted against the fading light of dusk. The years had changed him, as they had her, but the green fire in his eyes remained. His face bore the marks of hard journeys, the lines of fatigue, the scars of battles fought in lands far from this quiet village. Yet there was a gentleness in his step, a care in the way he approached the boy. "How is he?" Ethelstan's voice was low, roughened by years of travel, but filled with something akin to hope. Friday rose, moving to stand beside him. "The worst has passed. The fever broke just before dawn. He sleeps now, but he is still weak. The herbs will see him through." Ethelstan's eyes softened as he looked down at Halfdan. "He looks like you," he said quietly, almost to himself. "Strong, despite everything." Friday's lips pressed into a thin line. "He is stronger than I could have hoped." For a long moment, they stood in silence, the weight of unspoken words pressing between them. The years stretched like a chasm, filled with memories too painful to name aloud. The boy's presence was a living bridge between past and present, a fragile thread connecting two lives forever altered. Finally, Ethelstan broke the silence. "I did not know what to believe when they brought him to me. Found in a basket at sea, abandoned like driftwood. I feared he was cursed, or worse, a sign of some dark omen." Friday shook her head slowly. "He is no curse. The gods are not merciless, not always. Sometimes they demand sacrifice, yes, but also grant mercy in return." Ethelstan's gaze met hers, searching, hesitant. "And what of the truth? What have you not told me?" Her fingers tightened around the amulet of Freya at her neck. The secret she guarded was a blade she could neither sheath nor wield lightly. There are things that Priestess looked up, meeting his gaze for the first time since his arrival. It is not just his life that hangs in balance, she replied. It is mine as well. I carry the weight of what was done, but also the hope for what may yet be. Days passed, and with each sunrise, Halfdan grew stronger. The fever that had threatened to claim him became a distant memory, replaced by a vitality that surprised even the most skeptical villagers. Word spread quietly through the settlement of the child's recovery and the healer's skill. The fear and suspicion that had once surrounded Priestess began to fade, replaced by cautious respect. One morning, as the sky bloomed pale blue and the frost melted from the grass, a small group gathered at the edge of the village. Warriors and elders, some bearing the marks of battle, others the wisdom of many winters, approached Freydis's cottage with measured steps. The wind carried their voices clearly, words of gratitude, questions of healing, and, above all, a desire to understand. The leader was a man named Eirik, a seasoned warrior whose scars told stories of loyalty and hardship. His eyes, though wary, held a glimmer of something new, respect born from witnessing Freydis's quiet strength. Freydis Gunnardóttir, he began, his voice steady. The village owes you more than it can say. You have saved a child whom many believed lost, and in doing so, you have saved a part of ourselves. Freydis met his gaze, the years of exile and struggle pressing upon her, but also lifting in this moment of acknowledgement. I did what any would do to protect life, she answered simply. Eirik nodded. The truth of Halfdan's birth has been spoken of in whispers, but your courage and care have shown us the strength beyond bloodlines. The Jarl's anger may yet burn, but here, in this place, you have found allies. Her heart stirred with cautious hope. The path ahead remained uncertain, fraught with dangers both seen and unseen, but for the first time in many years, Freydis felt the fragile blossom of acceptance. Halfdan stirred from his sleep, his bright eyes meeting hers. He reached out, fingers curling around hers with a strength that belied his years. In that simple touch, Freydis found a balm for her soul, a promise that despite the shadows of the past, life could be reclaimed and redemption was possible. As the day unfolded, Freydis and Ethelstan sat together, sharing stories of distant lands and whispered prayers. Their bond, forged in hardship and hope, breathed new life into the quiet cottage. The boy, too, blossomed, not just in health, but in spirit, his laughter a rare and treasured sound amid the stillness. The village slowly began to shift, the fear woven into its bones loosening its grip. Though the past could not be erased, it need not dictate the future. Freydis knew that the road to peace would be long and winding, but with allies at her side and hope in her heart, she was ready to face whatever storms lay ahead. Under the watchful eyes of the gods, beneath the vast northern sky painted with stars, a fragile family found its way through the darkness. The ritual that had once been a secret woven in shadow now stood as a testament to resilience, love, and the unyielding will to protect what mattered most. In the quiet moments before sleep, Freydis whispered a prayer, not for forgiveness, but for strength. For herself, for Halfdan, for the village that had once cast her out. The gods, she believed, were watching still, their ancient presence a steady flame in the cold night. And in that flame, she found a beginning. The sun rose slowly over the village of Ravenholm, its pale light stretching across the frost-kissed fields and wooden rooftops, revealing a landscape transformed not only by the changing seasons, but by the passage of time and the tides of forgiveness. The once cold and mistrustful air that had wrapped itself around the settlement now carried a softer tone, as if the very earth had begun to heal from wounds inflicted by fear and secrecy. In the heart of the village, the great hall stood sturdy and resolute, its timbers weathered but proud. The banners still bore the scars of old battles, but beneath their faded colors, new threads had been woven, a symbol not of division but of unity. The clansmen and women moved about their daily tasks with purposeful calm, their eyes no longer shadowed by suspicion but glimmering with cautious hope. Priestess moved among them, her presence no longer one of exile or whispered accusation, but a quiet strength that had been earned through years of sacrifice and care. Her hair, still the deep red that cloaked her past, caught the sunlight as she gathered herbs near the edge of the village. The ancient runes on her hands, once a mark of mystery and fear, now seemed to hum with a gentler power, a blessing whispered by Freya herself. Halfdan followed close behind, his steps light and confident on the dew-dampened grass. The boy had grown into a young lad whose bright blue eyes shone with the same fierce light that had once unsettled his mother's heart. The crescent-shaped birthmark on his wrist remained, no longer a secret but a quiet badge of belonging. The villagers had come to accept him as one of their own, not merely the son of a forbidden ritual, but a child who had weathered storms and emerged stronger. The bond between Priestess and Halfdan was a living testament to the resilience of life itself. The hardships that had once threatened to shatter them had instead forged a connection unbreakable by time or judgment. Each day was a new chapter in a story that had begun in shadows, but now moved toward the light. A soft murmur rose from the gathering crowd near the longhouse's entrance, where villagers had assembled to witness a moment of significance, a ceremony both old and renewed. The air held a sacred stillness, as if the very spirits of the land had paused to watch. Jarl Ragnar Thorson, his hair now more silver than brown, stepped forward, his gaze tempered by the weight of years and the lessons harshly learned. The fierce anger that had once consumed him had given way to a quieter wisdom, the understanding that bloodlines were not simply a matter of birth, but of honor, loyalty, and the bonds forged through shared struggle. Beside him stood Eirik, the warrior who had once spoken words of respect to Priestess. Now, their shared history opened pathways for dialogue and healing. The old wounds between the Jarl and the Priestess had not vanished, but in their place was a fragile truce, one balanced on the promise of a future where past sins did not dictate the fate of those who followed. Ragnar raised his voice, steady and clear. Today, we honor not only the strength of our clan but the courage it took to protect what is sacred, life itself. Halfdan stands here as a son of Ravenholm, not by the simple bond of blood, but by the enduring spirit that unites us all. The villagers responded with a chorus of nods and murmurs, their skepticism softened by the passage of time and the undeniable presence of a boy who had survived where fate had once seemed cruel. Priestess stepped forward then, her voice calm but resolute. The gods guide us beyond the laws we set for ourselves. Freya teaches that fertility is more than the seed. It is the breath of hope, the strength to endure, and the courage to embrace the unknown. Halfdan, standing tall despite his youth, looked upon the faces around him, not with fear or uncertainty, but with a quiet confidence that spoke of a future still unfolding. The boy who had been born of secrecy, whispered prayers, and desperate hope now stood as a bridge between what had been and what could be. Elsewhere in the village, life moved forward in ways both subtle and profound. The old rituals, once rigid and unyielding, had softened, reshaped by experience and the understanding that survival required not only adherence to tradition but compassion and adaptability. The elders gathered in the evening to share stories not of judgment, but of forgiveness and the enduring power of community. Among the children playing near the frozen river, tales of Halfdan's courage whispered on the wind, carried in the laughter and games that echoed beneath the blue sky. The villagers, once divided by fear, had found new reasons to trust, to hope, and to build anew. Yet even as healing settled over Ravenholm, the past did not vanish completely. Friday knew that shadows lingered, old enemies, whispered threats, and the ever-watch. In the quiet moments before dawn, the village of Ravenholm slept beneath a blanket of stars, the promise of spring stirring beneath the frozen earth. And in the heart of that sleeping world, Friday and Halfdan stood ready to face whatever storms the gods might send, bound together by blood, by love, and by the enduring spirit of those who dare to hope. The flames flickered low in the hearth as the village of Ravenholm lay silent beneath a sky heavy with stars. The cold night air carried whispers of the past, echoes of sacrifice, betrayal, and the fragile threads that had bound a forbidden secret to the heartbeat of the clan. Friday sat quietly near the fading fire, her gaze fixed on the shadowed walls of her modest cottage. The weight of years pressed on her like the winter's cold, yet beneath it all, a delicate ember of hope glowed steady. Halfdan slept peacefully, his chest rising and falling with the steady rhythm of life. The fever that had once threatened to claim him was now a distant memory, a shadow faded by time and care. Friday's eyes traced the crescent-shaped mark on his wrist, a symbol once feared, now a quiet testament to endurance and survival. The boy who had been born in secrecy, wrapped in whispered rites and veiled truths, was no longer just a son of forbidden blood. He was a living promise, of resilience, of change, of a future carved not from fear, but from the courage to protect what mattered most. Her thoughts drifted back to the long nights by the altar, to the bite of the cold cave air, and to the heavy silence that had followed the ritual. The sacrifice had been great, the price steep, yet in those shadows, life had taken root. The gods had watched, perhaps with stern eyes, yet in their own inscrutable way, had granted mercy. Outside, the wind sighed through the pines, carrying the faint scent of smoke and earth. The village, once a place of suspicion and whispered accusations, had begun to heal. The old fears and bitter judgments softened by the passage of time, by acts of kindness and the undeniable truth of a child's innocence. Friday knew the scars would never fully fade, but they no longer defined the people who dwelled here. She rose slowly, the firelight casting long, trembling shadows across the floor. Her hands, marked by runes and years of toil, reached instinctively for the amulet of Freya resting at her throat. It was a symbol of faith and burden, of sacred duty and personal sacrifice. The goddess who had once demanded blood and secrecy now seemed to offer something different, a whisper of redemption. Halfdan stirred, his eyes fluttering open to meet hers. In that gaze, so pure and fearless, Friday found the strength to face what lay ahead. The boy's life was no longer just a secret to be hidden, but a story to be told in time. A story of survival born from desperation, told through quiet acts of love and unwavering resolve. The path ahead would not be easy. The old enmities and fears still lurked in the shadows, waiting for a moment of weakness. Gyda's bitter voice, the Jarl's wrath, the suspicion of the clans, these were threads woven deep into the fabric of their lives. Yet Friday understood now that courage was not the absence of fear, but the choice to move forward despite it. She stepped outside, the cold night air sharp against her skin, and looked toward the distant mountains. The land stretched out before her, wild and unforgiving, yet alive with promise. The northern lights began their slow dance across the heavens, ribbons of green and violet weaving a silent song of renewal. In their glow, the past and future seemed to entwine, fragile and infinite. Halfdan's small hand slipped into hers, steady and warm despite the chill. Together, they stood beneath the vast sky, a quiet family forged in shadow yet reaching toward the light. The gods watched above, ancient and eternal, witnessing the strength born not from blood alone, but from sacrifice, hope, and the unbreakable bonds of love. In the stillness, Friday whispered a prayer, not for forgiveness, but for the courage to protect this fragile gift. The boy, the village, and the legacy they carried were intertwined in a story that was still unfolding. And as the first breath of dawn painted the horizon with pale gold, she knew this was only the beginning. For in a world ruled by harsh laws and ancient gods, sometimes the greatest strength was found in the quiet defiance of hope, in the courage to embrace secrets as sacred, and in the unyielding will to protect life against the shadows of the past. The night had been long, the winter harsh, but beneath the cold and the silence, life endured. And in that endurance lay the true power of the gods. If this story has stirred something within you, an echo of the ancient struggles, the fragile hopes, and the human heart beating beneath it all, then join us again. The journey is far from over, and many stories still wait beneath the northern skies, whispered on the wind and carved in the stones of forgotten lands. Subscribe, share where you watch from, and be part of this tale's unfolding. For in the dance between fire and ice, between past and future, every voice matters. Because sometimes, in the quiet between worlds, we find the strength to rewrite our own fate.
If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to subscribe. We're just getting started and we really need your support. And may the gods grant you a legendary life.